Joining us online, we have a brief provocation from Kojo Koram, who's a senior lecturer at Birkbeck University. So, well, welcome, Kojo.
Fantastic. Okay, first of all, thank you all for having me. My name is Dr. Kojo Karam, and I am a reader at the School of Law at Birkbeck College at the University of London. And I was invited here to speak a little bit about facing histories in relationship to investment, sustainability, philanthropy across the world in 2023. And the history that I specifically focus on in my research, which I wanted to bring into the conversation today, is the history of empire. So, over the last, say, 4 or 5 years, there's been a great focus on empire, decolonization, and a lot of the topics that surround these particular issues. But primarily, we've discussed this question around empire and decolonization through the register of the cultural or symbolic sphere. Conversations around decolonization have really been focused on the statues that might be in our public square. They've been focused on the street names that we might have that speak to a particular colonial legacy. They've been focused on the kind of exhibitions that cultural institutions will host. They've been focused on the kind of television shows at one point that are on our TV. I don't know if people recall, at least those watching in the UK, that at one point in the 2020 moment, the focus on empire was all around, whether Fawlty Towers should or shouldn't be allowed on television. And so the entire conversation around empire has, on one hand, seemed very removed from the structures and systems of financialization, economics, and the movement of wealth across the world. And secondly, has often been projected back to a very distant historical moment, projected back to the 17th or 18th centuries, the times of plantation slavery, and seem as though they're very removed from the hyper-connected, highly digitized, fast-moving, hypermobile financial world of the 21st century. But what I want to remind the attendees in this talk is, number one, just how recent the history of empire was. So when we talk about decolonization, formal decolonization, which is a legal category, we're talking about the transition of maybe two-thirds of the world from a position of colonial subjectivity into a position of sovereign independence. And that happens in the 1950s, the 1960s, even up until the 1970s. So we're talking about within many of our lifespans. And secondly, I want to remind everyone that the primary purpose of empire was not cultural or symbolic. Empire was not a global statue building project. Um, the history of empire, all empires, not just the European ones, from the Mongol Empire to the Songhai Empire, all empires are concerned with the material, with the extraction and transfer of resources across the world. And in terms of my research focus, I specifically look at the British Empire because the British Empire had so much to contribute to the building of our current global legal and financial architecture. And when we think about the movement of money across the world in the 21st century, we cannot understand how that operates without facing that history of empire, particularly British imperialism. Um, One of the main things that distinguished British imperialism from its more state based European rivals was its skillful use of a conveyor belt of ostensibly private corporations. So companies like the Hudson Bay Company, the Royal Africa Company, the Royal Niger Company, if we want to take it to the 20th century, or the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. And if we, of course, want to think about the company that historians like William Dalrymple and Philip Stern still describe as the largest multinational corporation to have ever operated, even in the age of Google and Amazon, the East India Company. Now, part of the structures that facilitated the movement of wealth through these companies around the world continue to influence how the overall offshoring of wealth operates even up until today. And let me give you a concrete example. We're looking at the top three offshore financial centers, we might describe them, or the top three corporate tax havens in the world to this day, according to the Tax Justice Network, are all current British overseas territories. Places like the Cayman Islands, places like the British Virgin Islands, places like Bermuda. These are places that became part of British territory through the colonial operation in what used to be called the British West Indies. And up until to this day, the ability for these places to be bolt holes for the movement of global capitalism play a particularly insidious role in the expansion of wealth inequality all across the globe. We need to be thinking about the ways in which not just the resources that would be used to fund public services, that will be used to fund healthcare systems and education systems and welfare systems all across the world, get warehoused within these offshore financial centers. But we also need to think about the secrecy and lack of transparency rules that the wealthiest in the world benefit from in these territories that allow them to therefore be able to invest in particular assets in places like even the United Kingdom now. We know that billions of pounds are poured into the British housing market through offshore vehicles, which drive up the cost of housing beyond the ability for everyday everyday workers, whether they be nurses, whether they be teachers, whether they even be doctors or lawyers. They now really struggle to be able to afford a decent standard of housing in cities like London, cities like Manchester, and of course many other cities all across the world. Part of this has been driven by the way in which the offshoring of wealth allows some of the most wealthy people in the world to invest in resources that everyday people require through a veil of transparency that allows their actual beneficial interests to be relatively hidden. We can also look at one of the topics that has entered into the national conversation over the last couple of years, things like the non-dom tax status, which again benefits a very small portion of the wealthiest in our society. And whilst it's been discussed over the last year or two, primarily due to the tax status of the Prime Minister's own family, but also some other prominent politicians, the connection between non-dom tax status and histories of imperialism isn't something that's been relatively clearly articulated. The non-dom tax status is a direct legacy of British imperialism. It was introduced in 1799 by William Pitt the Younger in order to protect the assets of imperial entrepreneurs when he introduced his income tax, national income tax. And this aftermath of empire has continued to influence the inequality and growing insecurity of life, even in places like the United Kingdom, allowing people to be able to protect the assets and wealth that they accumulate overseas from the demands of the of the tax demands even in the United Kingdom. And so when we think about this question of facing the history, facing the legacy of empire, we need to think about what are some of those financial, legal, and commercial structures that would need to be dismantled similarly to how the protesters in Bristol in the summer of 2020 saw fit that they would dismantle the Edward Colston statue that was in the public square. It's one thing to face up to the symbolic legacy of empire, to look at how it influences the culture, influences the way that we speak, influences our ability to see each other as equal human beings. But it's a further task to try and face up to the financial and economic legacy of empire, to think about how were systems that were put into place to facilitate the expropriation and transfer of wealth across borders in the 17th, 18th, 19th, and even up until the early and mid 20th century, continue to contribute to the wealth inequality and the concentration of extreme wealth that is really undermining the very fabric of democracy all across the world, even in 2023. And so, with that, I will leave you with my contribution and thank you for your attention. And I look forward to um, learning more and participating in the conference in its entirety.